I wanted to start off by saying this is the stage of development theory that kickstarted it all for me. Okay, so what my hope is during this video, it's probably going to be a slightly longer one than some of the other ones I've done, is to explain through Erikson's stages of development and then towards the end connect it towards how I personally integrate it with Christian spirituality and formation. Okay. Now, let me preface that by saying I've spent 20 years being uh, a worker in ministry settings. And I say it that way because I've worked in churches and in camps and in prisons and at colleges. And so it's really something that I've brought into all of these fields. All right. Now, Erikson was a psychologist, Erik Erikson, and he didn't know his own father. And so he was plagued by this question of who am I and how do I become a self because I don't even have a father. So he actually named his last name Erikson after himself. He's like, well, I'm kind of fathering myself into adulthood. Okay, I have to mentor myself into adulthood. And so his whole life, he was trying to answer that question: who am I and what am I here to do? And those questions became the very thing that he then theorized this whole developmental framework about how a person grows through different tasks and asks that question: who am I? What am I here to do? In different ways throughout their entire lifetime. And so let me show you this chart that I made. It's going to look like it has a lot to it, but I hope it makes sense by the end. All right, so let's do it. Let's put that away and boom. Now I'm going to zoom in and zoom out on this, so don't worry about if it looks small. But Erik Erikson, he first theorized that there were 8 stages. And in some sense, he kind of did that because he was thinking in decades of life. And when he was writing about this, people were living roughly about 80. Okay. And since then, and even during his own lifetime, there were people starting to live with a longer and longer lifespan. And so some people have theorized, like his wife, that there's 9 stages. He even wondered about that himself. Some people have even brought it up to 12 stages because we have humans living up into their 120 years old almost. It's just incredible, right? But let's do this. I'm going to talk through it, and as I said, find ways to synthesize it or see what kind of wisdom it can give us about Christian spirituality and formation and doing ministry. Here we go. So there's 8 stages. They are infancy, childhood, preschool, school age, adolescence, young adulthood, middle adulthood, and maturity. Now, all of these take on different frameworks of how many years they are. So the first few stages are relatively quick: infancy into childhood, into preschool, into school age, into adolescence. And then the stages tend to grow longer with their timing. But let's talk about each of their core tasks, an example of it, the question asked of self, the desired outcomes, and the subpar outcomes. Here we go. So in infancy, the main core task is that of trust versus mistrust. You probably have heard this before. It's allowing ourselves to be fed. It's asking the question, can I trust others? Now, hopefully, this means that children learn not only to extend trust to others, but that people are able to be trusted by them. So there's a reciprocity that can start to be laid down like a foundation. But if this stage isn't done well, then children are often untrusting of others. If they experience their parents or caretaker as being untrustworthy, it will imprint on them for the rest of their lives that other people are untrustworthy. Now, one thing that Erikson noticed is that each stage, whether it's done well or poorly, kind of sets up the next stage to either be done well or done poorly, you know? And so it's important to recognize that however we were in infancy, it's going to affect the way we are in childhood, and then preschool, and then school age, and adolescence, and adulthood, middle adulthood, maturity. Okay? So let's go to the second one. Childhood. This is when we have the core task of autonomy versus shame and doubt. This is the time of toilet training, of dressing ourselves, putting on our own shoes. Now, the main question to ask is, can I do things for myself? Do I need others to do things for me? Have you ever seen a 3-year-old kind of smack their kid's hands and say, I can put on my Velcro shoes myself? Or say, I can comb my hair myself. I want to choose my own shirt today. Now, it's at this point the children learn to have a sense of determination and belief that they can do things. It's not that they do hard things, but it sets up this confidence that, I can at least do some things, rather than say, I can do nothing, which means that child will probably have a lot of shame and self-doubt. Now, if this stage isn't done well, children fall into shame and doubt due to feeling inadequate compared to others. So when 2 toddler siblings look at each other and one puts on Velcro shoes and the other one doesn't, that can cause shame. That can cause self-doubt. That can cause comparison of some sort that's not even verbalized, but it imprints, right? Now, third is preschool stage. This is initiative versus guilt. Think on the playground. Healthy play with other children is what happens at this point. Games and conversation and interactions, the main question is being asked often is, am I good or bad when I exert control or power over things around me? So think about it. It really does kind of build on the autonomy versus shame and doubt. Now it's not just putting on the shoes. Now it's, can I kick the ball? Can I run with the ball? Can I play on the playground and push the swing on my own? Do I have the ability? Am I good at this? Am I bad at this? And so that's why for preschool, and even a little bit older too, children are often just looking, am I good at this? Am I bad at this? What am I? Am I good? Am I good at this? I'm good at this. And so that's like a normal part of what they need to do at that season of life. Now, children appropriately internalize the validation they feel when they influence their environment. When this doesn't go well, it says here, children feel as though they are rejected and are not welcome to influence the world around them. So if a child can't kick the ball, if a child can't play on the swing, then it causes a sense of guilt, but it's kind of in front of people. Especially if they look at their parents and their parents are looking at their smartphone or their iPad, or not even like smiling at them with some affirmation or even saying, try again. That can cause some hurdles for them later on. Now, in the school age, this is kind of getting to be preteen, even. Kind of, yeah. And so this is about industry versus inferiority. It's about doing homework or learning a hobby for one's own self. And the question then is, can I do a good job? Now, previously it was, am I good or bad at this? But now it's more about tasks that are being given to them. Can I do a good job at folding my laundry? Can I make my bed and it's done well? And so it's got a different element than the play does in preschool stage. It has something more of like am I playing the value system of our community, of our family? Am I doing it well? Now, when this is done well, children learn that they are capable of doing things well outside of the family unit and that they are capable of coexisting with others. When this stage doesn't go well, comparison rules the day and children believe themselves to be lacking in comparison. Stage 5, adolescence. This is identity versus role confusion. And as somebody that worked primarily with teenagers and college students, this is a very important phase. At this point, there's self-identifying talk, social relationships. You're no longer defined by what you're good at in the same way, but now you're identifying who you are in connection to who your relationships are with. That's why friend groups are so important during teenage years. If a child does not have the ability to socially connect with others, it can set them back. It can actually be some hurdles for them, which is why teenagers actually need to be in social circumstances so that they can start to learn, oh, I can make relationships with people outside of my family unit. And so the question here is, who am I? Do I have a future as an adult? This identifying question is the big one. Here, teens develop a sense of self that is separate from and not merely an imitation of their parents' identity. Individuation begins. This means uh, it's right around 12, 13, 14 that teenagers start to fight with their parents a lot. Um, I once had a conversation with a dad that was very worried that his son had a mohawk and was listening to rap music. And I said, "Great job." And the dad was very confused. And I said, "No, your teenager is exactly where they need to be. They're identifying who they are against you, whereas previously they did their identifying by imitating you. They probably had the same haircut as you, maybe listened to Elvis just like you. However, now their tastes have changed and their identity is not so much based off of imitating the parents, but now it's in connection to their social circle. It's completely normal to do that, but it can be very painful for the parent. Now, what does this stage look like when it's done well or not well? Teens develop a sense of self that is separate from. Oh, I just read this. Let's go to the bad part. Teens over identify with their parents or become performers acting out false personalities at all times. If your teenager does not buck back against you, then there might be some problems going on. There might be peacefulness at home, but that's actually developmentally not what needs to happen. The teenager needs to push back and to ask, where's the boundary? Who are you versus who am I? Are we the same person? Because we're definitely different. Now, next up, young adulthood. This stage of life is all about intimacy versus isolation. The main thing that needs to be figured out is whether or not this person is capable of deep and or romantic relationships. Am I loved and wanted? Am I able to love and want others? And so now it's no longer just about the social sphere. Now it's about depth of connection with other people. And this is a normal part of young adulthood. But if someone doesn't do this well, it can cause hurdles for later on. Now, the desired outcomes for this would be young adults learn to form healthy and loving relationships with friends or a significant other. Depth and meaning, not that they're popular, but that they have a core group that is their core group, and maybe even from among them, someone becomes a spouse. If it doesn't go well, young adults isolate and fail to make meaningful connections. This is actually often what you see with some of these school shootings and isolated figures who are in their early 20s and they did not learn to have a sense of self, didn't know how to connect with others, and as a result, that isolation led to more depression and resentment and anger. And so you can actually really connect these stages with some of the ills that are happening in society. 7. This is the stage of generativity versus stagnation. This means parenthood and or work. The main question here is, what do I have to give to the world? Is what I have to give to the world, is it worth it? And so once a person has a sense of self, has a sense of community and deep relationship, and maybe even an intimate one, they then are more able to do this stage well, which is, okay, I've got my home base, I've got my people. Now I need to ask, what can I do for people beyond even that? Can I have a successful career? Is there something meaningful for me to do in the world? I know who I am. I know where I'm from. I know my people. But what can I do beyond that? Because it's really a question of meaningfulness. Desired outcome for this is adults create or nurture things that will last beyond them. The ability to do so creates a healthy amount of satisfaction with what they are bringing to the world. Now, at this point, this could be a parent who's finding a lot of satisfaction and meaning to their life in raising their children who will eventually outlive them. This is someone that is devoting themselves to a work that will go beyond them. And in some sense, this can be a little tragic sometimes, you know, because the subpar outcome is if adults cannot find something with which to contribute their community or work, be it work or family, sometimes they fall into a deep depression. Everyone's looking for meaningful work. And if you can't find it and you're going from job to job to job that's barely paying the bills and isn't even a meaningful job, even if it's a low paying one, that can cause stagnation. Rather than generativity and producing something for themselves and for the world, they turn inward. And it's almost like it's an intensifying level of the isolation that happens at stage 6. Now, in maturity, this is when somebody's actually past adulthood into late adulthood. Ego, integrity versus despair. That's the core task here. Now, at this point, someone does reflection on life, often through storytelling or sharing wisdom. And the main question to ask is, have I lived a good life? I mean, essentially, this is the archetype of somebody that sits on their front porch in their rocking chair and just tells stories of yesteryear. Now, a person might do that, and they might do it for the purpose of sharing legitimate wisdom, which is wonderful. We all need legitimate elders who have already been through the struggle of autonomy versus shame and doubt, initiative versus guilt, finding your community. Can you have an intimate relationship, right? Doing meaningful work. We need elders that have successfully done those things and can recount how they got through it, because then it helps the next generation, right? But it can also lead to someone constantly telling the story of their life. And it's almost as though it's a little bit like the earlier stages of, yeah, remember how I did that? That was good, right? That was good. How I worked for that company for 35 years. It was good that I sacrificed so much for that work over there. Because sometimes in this later stage, people are looking to see that their life mattered, that it had value, that it already produced value. Because at this point, someone's physical abilities and maybe even mental are quite diminished. But they maybe at least have the wherewithal to be like that. We had a good life, right? It was a good life. And some people find that they didn't, and other people find that they did. But what are the desired outcomes and subpar outcomes? Other adults or older adults reflect back over their lives and feel a sense of fulfillment, a life well lived. When it doesn't go well, and this can be people in their 80s sometimes, unfortunately, experience remorse, regret, despair over a life poorly lived, despondency, and nihilism. This is that depression that you can sometimes see in older adulthood, when people look back and they're like, I didn't do it well. I didn't do any of it well. And that can really be a sad place to be. Now, let me say a few last things about this. Remember, every stage helps set up the next stage for more success. Okay? Each stage is done well, great. But you can get stuck in one stage. You might actually be at the school age tasks. How can I do a good job? But something about it didn't land, or you didn't quite do it. And so you're still trying to do that task, even though physically, according to your body, you could be in your 20s. And you're still asking that question, how can I do a good job? It's like, that's the question of being 12 years old, man. Or what happens if someone is 58, but they never figured out who they are? And so they're stuck in adolescence asking, who am I? Do I have a future as an adult? Right? They're asking questions of, who am I in relationship to the world around me? You can see some people get stuck identifying who they are with what they've done, when actually at this point you should be a little bit further along on the road, right? So it's possible to chronologically grow in your body, but then developmentally and how you think about the world, you're still stuck at a lower stage. And one more thing about Erikson. His theory was that it's not that we need to constantly feel only trust, only autonomy, only initiative, only industry, only identity, only intimacy, only generativity, only ego integrity. He actually thought that it was a healthy thing to actually experience both poles, not just one or the other, but to actually feel mistrust, doubt, guilt, inferiority, confusion, isolation, stagnation, and despair. It's actually a healthy thing to learn how to experience those things in a healthy way and to not let those experiences of mistrust, doubt, guilt, inferiority, confusion, isolation, stagnation, despair to cause us to become stuck. Because there are some people in life for whom you should not trust. And as somebody that has learned how to experience the loss of trust of someone else, how can you integrate that wisdom about how to separate from those people? How can you learn how to feel inferior, right, school age stuff, in front of someone else? Have you ever seen someone who's in their 40s who's playing basketball and is getting really frustrated that somebody else is better than them? It's like, oh, you've got an inferiority complex. You don't know how to handle someone else being better than you at something. And so for Erikson, we need to experience both poles, the positive and the negative of each stage, and hopefully experience both of those in a healthy way. Okay, so now we talked through it. Let's connect it to Christian spirituality and formation and education / discipleship, all of that. Okay. Now, it's very important, I think, to know developmental theories like this, especially as a minister or a person in a, let's say, a wisdom role in a community. It could be a pastor or it could be a leader in some sense. If you are not aware of what stage you are in, you could very well talk to other people as if they are as well. So case in point, there have been times I've sat and listened to a Bible study or a sermon, and I could hear from the value system or between the words of what's being said, oh, you're like 62, but you're stuck in adolescence. You're asking the question of who am I? Do I have a future as an adult? You're 60s, right? You should be beyond this. But the thing is, it's important not just to broadcast your own stage of development and assume that everyone's there, because some people in the room might actually be that, especially if you're giving a sermon, right? You'll have a collective audience, hopefully of various ages, but there will be some that connect with your sermon and think it's fantastic because you're speaking to their stage of life. And so it's important to at least know this, because if you can be aware of your audience, be aware of the people that are in front of you, you want to speak to people on the level that they are at, not at the level that you are at. So for instance, let's say a young child gets up with a microphone and they start talking in church about, let's say, how do I do a good job? They're school age. They're talking industry versus inferiority. They could be speaking to a whole congregation that maybe has grown beyond that. But hopefully the congregation can look at that and be like, great job. You're exactly where you should be at this time of your life, right? And so it's very important to pay attention to this. Now, let's talk about arrested development, though. I actually think that in one of the hurdles or setbacks of not knowing developmental theories like this, especially in the field of ministry, is if we aren't careful, we might talk about things in such a way that encourages people to stay stuck at one of these levels. So for instance, if we are a part of a community that just asks about how do we do a good job, you have to do what the Lord wants you to do, just find out what that is and then do a good job of it, right? That would be a school age value system. That would be a school age core task. How do I do a good job? Industry versus inferiority, right? But the thing is, there could be people in the audience or in the congregation, in the pews, that have outgrown that and they are well beyond that. Okay. And so it's not just that you have to be aware of what stage of life you are at and not broadcasting that as an assumption that that's what everybody else is at, but also you have to recognize, am I interpreting this faith in one of these stages and one of these stages only? Because there are many people for whom the only task in life is to say, I did everything by the book, and I'm just hoping that God says, good job, well done. It's like, well, that's not bad, but depending on what stage of life you're at, you maybe should be further along. And if we are a part of a community that beats that same stage of life into us, of course you're eventually going to feel like, I've outgrown this. This place is small. This place is behind me. This is regressive for me to hear this type of stuff over and over and over and over again. Okay. So I think it's going to be very important for somebody that cares about Christian spiritual formation, that cares about development from childhood into adolescence, young adulthood, and older adulthood. If you want to do good ministry work, you have to learn how to speak to every decade of life and learn how to invite people into the next stage. And maybe, how about this? You could even set up particular tasks on purpose, right? So you have a teenage lock-in, a sleepover. You could intentionally fill the evening with things that are going to speak to them in their school age or adolescence. You could actually very easily go to a young adults retreat for a weekend and just solely talk about intimacy versus isolation. Talk about what does it mean to have a deep or romantic relationship with someone else. And by doing that, you would actually be 100% zeroing in on the task that they are at. But if you're at a young adult retreat and all you're doing is asking them, have you lived a good life? Tell me some stories about it. They're just in their early 20s. They haven't had enough successes and failures to reflect on their life yet. How can they have ego identity when they haven't even really lived a long life yet? Does that make sense? So all this goes to say, I think in my personal understanding of the world and as I've grown, Erikson was fascinating because it was the stages of development that he proposed was the first time I kind of realized, oh, there's a map. There's a road map that guides us through some of these things. And it wasn't long before I started wondering, okay, how can I bring this together? So one last story. I once was having a conversation with a pastor who really wanted to do Rick Warren's book, The Purpose-Driven Life, and came to me and said, will you do this book with the teenagers? And I said back, I can, but it will be missing their developmental stage completely. And I said, the question of purpose is the question of adulthood. It's not the question of adolescence. For them, their main question is, who am I? Not what do I have to give to the world? And so if I could do it, but it would completely miss. And I just remember that pastor doing a massive eye roll and just looking like, you are so disobedient. I felt like there was just vibes of annoyance. But to me, I was thinking, no, I'm speaking from actual scholarship. I'm speaking from caring about the youth enough that I want to speak to them in their developmental stage because that's what they need. And for me to spend an enormous amount of time and 3 months of preparation talking about a stage of development that they're not at would actually be a waste of time. That's a great book for adults. I'm not saying it's a bad one. But if you don't recognize that you could be completely missing your target because you don't take the target seriously enough, then you're not living a good life, you know? Uh, so I have found that as I've shared this developmental theory or framework with people, it's very easy to see some ways in which it connects. It's very easy to see how Christian spiritual formation can actually come alongside and help people to grow through all of them, because as Irenaeus of Lyons says, the glory of God is a man or woman fully alive, thriving. The most wonderful thing for God is to see somebody doing really well in life. And so, out of love, I think it's important to study things like this so that you can bring it alongside your work, so that you can not just do loving work, you can do efficient work that speaks to people and resonates with them in the stage of life that they are at. So, this was a longer video, but I hope you don't mind. And yeah, have a lovely day. All right? We'll see you next time.